Hello, everyone. Welcome to Optimize for Humans. I'm Usha. I'm your podcast host, and I work as a coach and a consultant, or a coast. We can just combine them all together as I have. I'm very excited to be speaking with Bob Gower, who has been a colleague and a friend, and I'm very excited to mine your brain today, Bob. Please introduce yourself and tell us why you're excited about this topic.
Yeah, well, hi everybody. I'm Bob Gower. I'm the founder of a consultancy called Splendid Torch. We are relatively new. We're just getting off the ground. I'm a refugee of the consulting world. I've been in and around it for probably about 15 or 20 years. And I'm really excited. I've always been, how to put it, animated by the idea that business can serve humans better, that organizations in general can serve humans better. They're the source of our greatest pain and sometimes our greatest achievements. And now that we have AI in the mix, I think it's really fundamentally changing the way we organize and has the potential to do that for the better. And I would like to participate in that story. So I'm very happy to talk about that today.
Thanks, Bob. We were just, I'll clue our audience in on our inside joke just now, but I was saying my one liner about this podcast is AI adoption that's optimized for all humans and really optimized for humanity, along with optimized for humans. And I love that we share that goal and passion and that we get to play together
Yeah,
as part of that.
exactly.
Um, I'd love to start with just asking you, what are you seeing right now when it comes to AI adoption within organizations?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm seeing a lot of, there's all sorts of different ways to approach it. And I see a lot of people who are really scared of it and not doing anything about it. There's a statistic that came out. Our mutual friend Joe, I think, gave it to me the other day. And it was like that 70% of 6% of executives think their employees are enthusiastic about AI, where only 31% actually are. And I think it's because, a lot of it has to do, I think, with the orientation of the executive themselves, right? So, like, is the CEO, are they risk averse or are they, embracing it or not? Because, I mean, AI is finding its way into highly regulated industries right now, but you'll see a lot of like mid-sized companies, especially who are like, oh, no, no, that's too insecure, which it takes me back actually to the Christmas, was it Christmas 2000, 2001? I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but I remember when we were all afraid to put our credit card information onto the internet. And then there was one Christmas where all of a sudden we all started doing it. And then the internet just sort of like took over all of our lives. And I feel like we're kind of at, the world is accelerating. So I feel like we're kind of at one of those moments right now where, you know, right now I think everybody's scared of AI and or they're fully embracing it in this kind of like weird way. But I
Say
think
more.
well, I mean, the way I break it down is that AI like other people in general, we can use it in a variety of ways, right? We can say we can have it do something for us. We can work with it to do something together, which is my favorite way to do it. I use it for writing. I never have it write for me, or I might have it write a draft or rework a draft or rework an idea. But I'm always there. It's always my co-pilot. I'm always in control. And I've found that surprisingly, especially with the updates from just a month ago when 4.6 came out when Claude, like it's blown me away, like how much better it is now at understanding my voice, understanding what I'm trying to say. Um, so that's the doing piece, right? But you can automate, and I see a lot of people just trying to automate stuff, but what they end up doing is automating like broken processes. We've talked about this a lot in other conversations, right? And then you just break the process more. I also see people using AI as the AI narrative. We just saw some layoffs this week, I think, and we're going to keep seeing them. People attribute them to AI, but really, I think it's an investor narrative because what people have done, they overhired during the pandemic. They want to shed headcount, and they're using AI. AI is a convenient scapegoat. It's not really showing those kind of productivity improvements, or
Yeah.
it's not baked into the workflows the way you might see it. So. And then there's the thinking side, right? So there's the doing and the thinking. And so when I write, it does think for me a little bit, but I also like to use it as a strategy partner. I talk to it all of the time about what I'm building, and it finds narrative threads that I wasn't finding for myself. So I don't think I would have the company that I have without it. Not because it's automating anything for me, not because it's doing anything for me, but basically because it's helping me see things that I couldn't see otherwise. And it's helped me get through some really, really sticky spots. And then there's the big scary bit, which is, thinking instead of you, right? Or thinking for, like rather than thinking with you. And then if you combine that with the doing, and if the doing happens to be weaponry, like that's, there are nightmare scenarios out there as well. Not to get too depressing on the podcast, but
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to always be thinking of, and actually, like, kind of what I liked about what you just shared is like the full spectrum of the possibilities in which we're engaging with this right now. I think there's the like very beginning place where tons of leaders I'm seeing are like, it helps me write my emails.
yeah,
Like, great, that's tier one.
yeah,
And then what I really like about what you're saying, speaking to around the pattern spotting, which is what I noticed, which is like it actually helps you think because it helps connect the dots in your own brain
yeah,
that you're too close to see and notice and look at.
yeah,
And all the way through to it can do on your behalf. And I think this is what, for the nerds out there, I think these are the experiments with OpenClaw that many brave souls are venturing out and trying, which is what is an agent that, can do on your behalf? What does that mean? And what does that look like as part of that? One frame that I found really helpful for myself as part of this is think of it as an overenthusiastic prodigal intern that's also the child of the CEO. So there's no accountability because it's a Nepo baby.
right.
It's overly enthusiastic. It really wants to help you. It's got PhDs on all kinds of subjects, so it's a prodigal, but it's an intern. It doesn't have the lived context yet. It just has the education and the intelligence and the knowledge. And so what would I trust that intern with is what I would trust AI with. And that's just been a helpful framing for me to think about every time I, hit go on something.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I like that framing. And then I keep going back again, just 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, to when we're recording this on March 6th, and I think it was March 4th or 5th, right? That that the 4.6, Anthropic released their new model, and OpenAI released their new model, which was very similar. And it blew, for what it's worth, like it blew me out of the it kind of blew me away about like how much more capable it was than I ever actually even kind of thought it could be.
Yeah.
And so now I start wondering, like, if we're having this conversation a year from now,
Yeah.
what are we talking about? Like, is it still that intern, or has it become
Yeah.
something else? And it's a little bit scary, honestly. Like I'm
Yeah.
but it's also, I think, really exciting. I've lived through a few different technical revolutions. I'm not a particularly young man. I worked in newsrooms and watched them get digitized back in the 90s, and I ran production for newspapers back then, and watched digital photography come in, watched direct to play printing come in, and all of that, and then watched the internet. And then I worked during the dot-com boom. I worked directly on the internet, went through the what is it, the Y2K scare and all of that. So like this isn't my first rodeo when it comes to scares, but at the same time, this one does feel really substantially different. They've all felt different, I suppose, but there's something deeper and richer, and there's more opportunity and I think more risk in this one than there's ever been before. So
Yeah. So along those lines, I think, one of the things that I know we both talked about and noticed is this tendency for organizations and leaders to think about this as a technology or a tool. And there's a real problem with that kind of framing. And I'd love to hear from you. What's missing when we think about it in that? What's the problem with that as a framing?
yeah, well, I mean, going back to previous, revolutions, technical revolutions, I remember very
Yeah.
clearly back when the internet was considered an IT department problem, right? And so
Yeah.
and we had this, we had the idea of webmasters, but the webmaster was seen as a very, technical role inside most places. And, people were worried about like modem speeds and those kinds of things. But but the way the technology was really disrupting the way work could get done, there were a few people, certainly seeing, obviously the world changed, and we all kind of got with the program in a certain way. But I think seeing these, you know, these technologies as isolated things that you kind of bolt onto an organization. You create a new department, you create a new C-suite role that is associated with that. Actually, I was talking with a HR researcher earlier today, kind of about this, that like this technology, I think, requires um, executives to collaborate in a way that we've always wanted them to. I've been in the future of workspace for a long time, the business agility space for a long time, and I've always seen like C-suite executives not talking to each other was kind of like one of the biggest thorns in my side, right?
Yeah.
That I needed product to work with technology, to work with HR, to work with strategy and operations. We needed all of these pieces working together. And I think what we're seeing now with AI is it takes that thing that was sort of a nice to have or a really good idea and makes it kind of essential, right? Like that because if you don't coordinate, or if you see this, we have this sort of model, this idea at Splendid Torch that we have to think about it as architecture. And so we have to take strategy into account, operations, culture, governance, and enablement, right? But most AI adoption policies are looking either, you see a lot of talk about governance, risk, those kinds of things. You see a lot of talk
Yeah.
about enablement and training, a
Right.
little bit in operations, a little bit in strategy, and almost nothing in culture. As a matter of fact, it's
Yeah.
almost anti-culture because people are using it as an excuse to lay people off, and everybody
Right.
everybody is becoming afraid, which is, as you know, right, as we've discussed, right,
Yeah.
fear is a thing that destroys culture, and so now,
Yeah.
so I think where I see the opportunity is in tying all of these pieces together.
We're talking about the sort of five elements of the
Mhm.
architecture that you were kind of alluding to. I'd love to actually take that one bit by bit,
Yeah, sure.
just so we give leaders a real sense of like what should they be thinking about. So let's start with the strategy piece, the
Sure.
kind of foundational layer, as I've kind of held it in your framing. So tell me more about that. What should a leader be thinking about as part of that?
Well, for me, it's less about what your strategy is, and it's more about, can people articulate it?
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of, I mean, that's always been an issue. Like I'll walk into companies and I'm like, what do we do here? Like,
Right.
what do we really do here? What are our priorities for this quarter, and why are those priorities? OKRs, I
Yeah.
watched, they've helped quite a bit. I think it's a really powerful tool, mainly because it generates a conversation around and has people actually commit things to paper. But often the strategy, especially in smaller companies, but even in very large companies, the strategy is often what the CEO is thinking that week. Like and things can change quite a bit. I think we've all been. Um, but then when you add AI into it, what I've seen, I'm talking about an anti-pattern rather than a pattern, but the anti-pattern you see a lot is, hey, we have to do something with AI. And that's coming from the board or it's coming from the C-suite. And
Right.
it's because people are afraid of hey, go check out this AI thing and go and give me. And what they're looking for is almost like an investor narrative or a board narrative or some, and rather than really deeply trying to understand what the technology is, going back to, okay, what kind of business are we in? What is AI good for? And where might we apply it? And rather than like investing in a huge platform, because a lot of these companies will solve the problem by going off and signing a massive, multi-million-dollar contract with with an individual provider and say, okay, we've got AI handled, check, because and they're essentially outsourcing it. I mean, I'm not saying don't do that. I mean, sometimes you definitely need like the tools, but like I believe we need to think more about like where can we apply it, and where can we apply it in a way that allows us to test and learn. And I think that's the big, that's been the business agility strategy, message for a long time, that
Yeah.
you don't know what a customer wants until you try to sell it to the customer. And so you minimum viable product, you offer it to them.
Yeah.
And so we've come up with this idea, of like minimum effective intervention, right? Like, so if I'm going to change, so strategy in some ways it relates to the other pieces. Like, so if I'm going to change my operations, or if I'm going to enable my team, what's the minimum I can do that allows me to test my assumption? Like, so let's really be strategic. Let's be strategic about how we apply AI. So I think there's sort of two pieces. One, what do we do as a business? What's important to us? Who is our customer? What are we trying to do for them? How do we change their world? And then the second piece is, how does AI potentially fit into that? And then the third piece is, how do we strategically apply AI to our set of problems, right? And I think, yeah, you're right to call it out. that's often where the conversation needs to start. I mean, obviously, when we work with companies, they're mid-flight, so maybe that's there's stuff that's already there, but it is the kind of it's where things start.
Yeah, I think, a frame that I hold is it's almost like, if we boil strategy all the way down to the basics, it's where are we now? Where do we want to get to?
Right.
What's the path from A to B? And I
Hmm.
think there's an opportunity here to actually question what is B,
Yeah.
and what, like, is that still the right thing? And, we've made some assumptions about how we get from A to B so far, but actually there's a whole new intelligence available to us. What does that change about how we get from A to B? But that whole piece about like starting with the problem, starting with what are you trying to achieve,
Yeah.
and how does this fit into that picture, I think is really wise
You
place.
remind, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but you're reminding me of something I watched the other day that really, it made me surprisingly very sad. And but
Mm,
I was watching a video of somebody describing what you could do with Claude Code, or not Claude Code, sorry, Claude Cowork. I was like, I
hmm
want to I want to understand this interface a little more, and what can I do with it? And I have a few use cases I'm considering. And this was like a solopreneur who like that's her job is YouTubing, and this is and she started showing about like how she had Claude Cowork post for her on Twitter, and she said it posts viral content. I don't know what she means. It posts viral content for me on Twitter, and then then it even updates my metrics, and I was like, okay, that's really cool. You're automating all of these things, but I
yeah,
started to think about like now we're missing the value. Like now we've removed the value of Twitter entirely out of the process, right? Like because to me, if I'm not on Twitter, I'm very rarely on social media even, but I don't mind somebody like using AI to like help them write something, help them express something more clearly, make a cool picture, a cool video, whatever, right? That's great. But the assumption is that there's a person behind that, that I'm interacting with the avatar of a person. And she had basically automated the whole process. Now, this was old content of hers that was getting repurposed, so it was her to a certain degree. But it started to feel like a dystopian scenario to me, where you just have machines talking to each other, and and somebody's buying ads, so somebody's making money. But and so I'm the place I'm least excited about AI is in the digital product space and in the information product space, which are the big disruptors of the last 20 years. I'm much more interested in what it can do. And, I think we talked about this with you earlier, right? That I'm more interested in atoms than I am in bits. I'm more interested in like one of my main clients right now makes batteries, right? Like I'm really like that's and I'm like, okay, well, how can we apply this to R&D? How can we apply this to distribution? How can we apply this to your advertising, your branding? Like there's so many use cases for it, but at the end of the day, we're producing an energy storage device that provides value to people. So that's wonderful, right? Whereas if I'm just producing a piece of, like a piece of information in order to generate leads back to me, I understand the utility of it from the solopreneur standpoint, but like I just found it so depressing. I sorry for the digression, but like I just found myself really unexpectedly like sad after I
yeah.
read that or after I watched the video. Yeah,
Well, this really dials up the noise in an
yeah,
already noisy system. Now
yeah,
there's more noise,
yeah,
and then we're using agents to help us filter the noise. So there's a bunch of agents that are creating a bunch of noise and a bunch of agents who are filtering through the noise. And I mean, it's an interesting world for sure.
yeah.
And I want to maybe start with something that I've heard you say that really resonated with me, which is if you have like a workflow or a process that was dysfunctional to begin with, and you put AI on top of it. And by dysfunctional, I mean, is it giving you the impact that you want? Unclear. And you just throw AI on it.
Yeah.
What happens?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm just going to go back to my newspaper days because I can remember like at one point I was leaving a paper and I had completely revamped their operational system. That's actually the place where I found that I have a knack for systems and I love them and I love operations. And that's kind of where my current career started. It's like 30 some years ago now. But the what I realized is that when I had to train my replacement is like how much was just in me that I then had to express this other person, and also I had to express the why, why we did it this way, why do you do these things in this order, and when I had come into the newspaper, I found the workflows, and I didn't have the language for it at the time, but the workflows were incredibly broken. Like it was just like people sort of flailing about passing, you know, notes from a copy editor back to a page designer, without any like, no, there was no tracking of that. There was no, this was a small paper. It was a weekly paper in Silicon Valley. Um, and, and so, and I think that's like most organizations, what passes for operations in most organizations is really collected habit. And,
Right.
and it's sort of like, and culture is sort of like the way we do things around here, and the way we do things around here is just the way we started doing something a long time ago. That what's that old story about you put like they put five monkeys on in a room with a floor that could be electrified. Did you ever hear about this? And they put bananas on top of a ladder, and then so whenever one would go for the bananas, they would electrify the floor and so it's really cool. Sorry, I didn't even know this is true. So these are imaginary. It may have really happened. I'm not sure, but the story is essentially that like the monkeys that would start, like beating other monkeys in order to keep them from grabbing the bananas because they started to associate the electrified floor with the bananas, and then what they found is that just became a habit. Ignore the bananas
Right.
and when they stopped electrifying the floor, if they swapped the monkeys out one at a time, you had now had five monkeys who had never experienced the electrified floor who were still avoiding the bananas on top of the ladder. And I think that's like it sticks with you, right? It's like
Yeah.
such a powerful metaphor for the way accrued
Absolutely.
habit becomes and to my
Yeah.
mind, operations is kind of the accrued habit of an organization. So we use
Right.
the tool. If we have actually you gave it you were we were talking earlier today about like you have five levels of approval, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
why
Mm-hmm.
do five people have to sign off on this particular thing? Well,
Right.
we've always kind of done it that way. We don't have time to
Right.
rethink it, so let's just keep going. And so I forget your exact question, but I'm just going to say the thing that excites me so much about operations here is I feel like we've been dealing for decades with very poor visibility into how things actually get done inside of organizations. And I believe AI really presents the opportunity for me to have much more situational awareness. I have more situational awareness about the way I do things because I can play back calls, or I can go through a call and I say, what did I miss? Because I miss things all the time. I'm not a great listener sometimes. Or like it can help me understand like where do the handoffs actually happen. I actually think the framework business is dead, which has driven the consulting business for so long, because I'm going to be able just to put a problem in, put a bunch of data in, and it'll come back with a tuned framework to my particular situation and help me clean up workflows. It's already done it for me numerous
Yeah.
times, and it's just going to get more powerful.
Yeah. And so to just kind of thread this together, the strategic piece is like having clarity on, what are we trying to solve here? And then the operations piece is really what habits have we accrued trying to solve the problem? And is that actually serving us in solving the problem before we throw AI on top of it to continue to like, I like the monkey analogy to
Yeah.
continue to like beat each other up to not get the banana.
Yeah,
Let's,
strategy is what we're trying to do, like, and
yeah,
what we think is going to happen if we do this thing. Operations is the way we do it, either efficiently or effectively, depending on. I prefer the word effective than efficient,
yeah.
but yeah, that's it.
And then let's talk culture.
Yeah.
How does that fit into this?
Well, culture. I mean, the best operations are driven by culture, in my opinion. From how to put it, an academic perspective, I'm a systems theory like I go back to complex
Hmm.
systems. And that's actually how I got into the line of work. I was doing an MBA focused on sustainability, and when you focus on this was 20 years ago. When you focus on sustainability, you talk a lot about complex adaptive systems um, and the Club of Rome, and anyway, but we won't go into the whole history of it. But one of the things I love that it led me into is I did a deep dive on the Toyota production system. That was like the first time I was like, okay, they're using a sort of a complex system principles in order applying it to operations. And one of the lovely things, and I think the most effective things about the Toyota production system, whip limits and all sorts of things are value and are all valuable. But what was really interesting is that the person who needed the supplies on the floor of the factory knew the name of the person they were getting the supplies from. So they built a human to human relationship. I need to go to Dave, and Dave needs to give me this, and then right, I need more X. I know the name of the person, so it's sort of like a human to human relationship. They also created places where people would workshop together on how we could improve our connection. And to my mind, that's that's the whole game right there. And that is a culture game. Culture is, can we honestly talk with each other about the issues that we're having? Can we arrive at a potential better way to do things? And can we do that in a repeated way? And engagement follows. I believe personally that humans were natural problem solvers. Like when we tell people just follow the rules, just hit the punch card or whatever, that we're actually doing something which is almost like anti-human or anti-human nature, right? We're asking people to constrain themselves unnaturally into a format. Um, Whereas if we say people like, you probably want to do a better job, let's talk about, how do you think you can do it better? Let's work together to figure that out. That's all culture. Like, you can't do that without psychological safety, because people can't talk about their real problems or the real potential solutions if they don't feel psychologically safe. You can't execute new solutions if people don't trust if I don't trust Dave to give me my stuff, like, and I think culture gets overcomplicated sometimes, because at the end of the day, culture is really just, I think of it as how to put it, the interpersonal or the emotional landscape inside of which everything else happens, right?
Yeah.
And so the reason culture, I've debated putting culture first, but I kind of like it in the middle here, right?
Yeah.
And the reason I like it in the middle is because I feel it's like it connects to everything else. The example, the thing I always say is, if I'm, because I've been fixing organizations for a couple decades now, like that's been my job for a long time. I would rather have a team with terrible operations, maybe not quite know what they're trying to do, but who really enjoy working together and can be honest with each other and trust each other. Because I can improve the operations and we can talk strategy. Like, if we have that, we can do it. But if I go into a place where super sharp strategy, super, structured operational frameworks, but everybody is scared of each other and everybody hates each other and everybody dislikes that place is just going to stay broken, because people are going to find their way around the good stuff that you've defined. People are going to be, everybody's going to develop oppositional, some, conflict. They're going to want to have conflict. They're going to want to fight. They're going to
Yeah.
want to ignore you. They're going to be passive aggressive, right? So culture is, to
Yeah.
me, it's essential, and I think it's just more and more essential now. And that's why I'm so upset when I see companies doing these layoffs that I think are just destroying their cultures. So
Yeah, I think that's a huge one, because when I speak with people one of the things I hear pretty commonly is how much it feels like AI is being shoved down their throats, and how much they're worried about, participating in something, being forced to participate in something that ultimately replaces them. And it makes me so sad that that's the narrative,
yeah,
because here's this incredibly powerful thing that can unleash your own creativity and be an incredible strategic partner to you.
yeah,
But the way it's getting in the muck and in the mix with all of this in a funny way.
yeah. And people feel like they're training their own replacement, which they may be,
Totally.
right?
Yeah.
It may be true, right? So
Yeah. Let's chat governance.
yeah, governance. This is a word that gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah. What do we even mean when we say governance?
To my mind, governance is really just the rules by which we do everything else, right? It's
Yeah.
sort of the boundaries, it's the constraints on the system, right? And often
Yeah.
they're applied externally by they're regulatory, in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Um, the thing I'm very excited about, so my undergrad was in philosophy, so I go down these philosophical paths sometimes. I'm particularly interested in ethics and moral philosophy,
Yeah.
and what I've been building into the AIs I've been building is like, well, this is what good means to me, right?
Hmm.
And because I have kind of the background in philosophy, I can be, somewhat precise, right? Like, I take an approach of like, we're trying to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Going back to your thing about for all humans, right? Um, but anybody who's studied the trolley problem also knows that that leads to some very strange moral conundrums. Like, does that
Yeah.
mean that there's the one variation on the trolley problem where it's like, do you push the fat person onto the tracks in order to stop the train to save the five other people? Like, is that the
Right.
same as pulling the lever that, like, and to my
Right.
mind, then I go back to Kant on that and deontology. Sorry to
I love
rant
this.
this
Keep
way. But
going.
anyway,
Yeah.
but I go to deontology, and one of Kant's points is like that you should never, like, a kind of a rule, like deontology is very rule based, right? And the
Mm.
rule is that you should never use another human being as a means to an end. They are always an end in and of themselves, right? And so, and including yourself, right? And so it keeps you from like doing a lot of self-sacrifice. And I really love those two things kind of working together. We're trying to do the greatest thing for the greatest number of people, but we're also not going to like use other people as cannon fodder in order to do that good. We're not, we're going to treat everybody with dignity, everybody with respect.
Right.
And I know we're talking about governance, but to my mind, governance is sort of the most philosophical place. It's the place where where we say, what is good? What does good mean? And some of the most interesting conversations I've had with executives about AI is around this particular thing, because I think it forces us to, because we're training agents to do things autonomously often, right? Like we
Yep.
have to give them really good instructions. We all talk about alignment of the foundational models, which is essentially a governance or a philosophical question, right? Like, is it aligned with human values and human needs?
Yeah.
And I think I mean, more power to them if they're doing it. I'm a little more happy with what Anthropic is doing than with what, say, OpenAI or some other companies are doing, or Grok, right?
Yeah.
Other companies are doing in terms of this. But I also think it's up to each of us and up to each organization, in organizational leadership, and each individual to have to define that for ourselves. And it pushes us because there is never a clean answer in this place. So governance also has very, very practical things, right? About like, where does our
Yeah.
data live? Are we,
Yeah.
are we adhering to the laws of the municipalities that we find ourselves in, and all of those kinds of things as well. So
Yeah, and I think of it too as, what's the risk we're open to, what's the risk we're not open to, and so much of it just feels like making explicit a lot of these assumptions that live in the context, things
yeah,
that we just sort of know or assume. Let's make those more explicit as
hmm
part of all of that.
yeah,
Um, I had another thought, but now I'm
sure.
just thinking about the trolley. So
Sorry.
let's talk about enablement. I thought the solution to the trolley problem is to throw yourself on the track to stop the
Yeah, but
trolley. But
what if you're not big enough? What if like,
yeah, totally.
yeah, I don't know. I love trolley problem.
I think, just there is something there. I found my thought, which is
Yeah.
there is something there as part of that, which is with the trolley problem. The interesting thing is what it exposes is your values,
hmm
right? What do you value? What is important?
Yeah.
What are the boundaries of some of these things? And I think that's a really important thing for us to be thinking about, especially around like AI agents and all of that, which is how do you want the people interacting with now this new entity that lives in your organization to feel? Do you want your employees to feel terror that, they may be losing their job soon as they interact with this agent? Do you want your customer to feel, oh, this is just a bot? Like, I don't have the faith that like it's actually addressing my concern. That happened to me today. I sent an email. I clearly got back a bot response. And
hmm
I was like, this isn't, what do I
Yeah.
do with this? I still have to keep following up. So there's something in there about like, what are the values, going back to the culture piece, and how do you want people to feel in connection with you and with every extension of what you as an organization are. And that now includes all of these autonomous AI agents.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's also not mysterious. Well, two things. One is moral philosophy. What's interesting to me is the conversation you have around the questions, because there are never any clean answers. I distrust anybody who's like, I have this system and the system gave me, I have this algorithm and this algorithm gave me this answer. I believe human life is way too complex, way more complex than that. And AI is just an extension of us. So, we're always going to be kind of like, but I also think like when we talk about like a job, so there's a book that came out a few years ago called Bullshit Jobs, where this anthropologist is basically saying that most jobs, like many jobs within the modern world don't really produce any value for anybody and probably just need to disappear. Um, but at the same time, I think also about I actually spent some time. I have some old friends in India. I've done a lot of business there, and I remember I was staying with some friends in Calcutta a few years ago, and he was a college professor, and his wife was an old friend of mine. I knew them both many years ago when we all lived in Japan. And they employed a driver partially because and they were very poor. They weren't, these aren't rich people. Like they're, they had a car and a driver. And part of it was because the roads were so dangerous, but part of it was also because in Bengali culture that this man lived in, he was like, this man might starve if he's not employed by me. My driver might starve if he's not employed by me. So that is not a bullshit job. Even if I can drive myself, if I can do this for myself. And so I think we need to think about sort of social contracts. And like, if I go to, if, I know, like we have Blank Street Coffee here in New York that is trying to automate the corner coffee shop. They're a private equity funded thing. I avoid it at all costs because I'm like, I think barista is a valuable
Okay.
job, and people should be able to make a living as a barista. Like they should be able to do that. We don't need to automate everything. So like it forces us to address some very, very fundamental things about what it means to be human and what it means to live in society and what it means to be part of a community.
Yeah, just agree and echo and resonate with all of that.
Mm.
And there's a deeper thread there around, again, like what is the experience and value that you want to create in this world? And what does that look like? And what does that mean?
Yeah.
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 Enablement, our final pillar of the architecture. I'm going to keep us honest here.
Yeah, thanks. This is where everybody starts, right? It's like, how can we train,
Right.
how can we get the tools in the door, and how can we train people to use the tools? And and this is where we're treating AI as a SaaS rollout, like
Mm,
we've bought the tool, operations has, funded the tool, or IT has funded the tool, whatever. And now we have to like,
yeah.
and I've spent a fair bit of my career doing some of this, right? It's not necessarily, well, actually, I know I worked for a tool maker, 10, 15 years ago. And, a lot of our work was on helping them roll the tool out within the
Yeah.
organization. And I think this is why we're seeing, because people are starting here, this is where this is why we're seeing so much failure in the AI, rollout or whatever AI adoption market right now. And it's because AI doesn't play by the rules, and it also changes too fast. And if I'm rolling something out over a 6-month period, the world has moved on very far, beyond where I was 6 months ago. And so I'm designing for a world that doesn't exist anymore, or I'm enabling a tool. Yeah. So, I mean, it's important. I think it's going to be a lot more self-directed. The way I often enable myself with AI tools is like, I just say, tell me how to use you, like, let's talk,
Yeah.
right? How do I do this? Or how do I do that? And yeah, so,
Yeah.
and I think we're going to find a lot more I think it's really going to disrupt the L&D market quite a bit, as it already has. I mean,
Agree.
yeah.
Yeah, so we've got strategic clarity, operations, culture, governance, and enablements. And, the reason I wanted to go through them
Yeah.
bit by bit is because I think this is a much more holistic problem. This isn't just a tool. This isn't just something you're throwing on top of
Yeah.
existing things. This is actually an opportunity to really reimagine, like, who are we? What are we trying to create?
Yeah.
How do we want people to feel and benefit and interact? And what does it look like to engage in a meaningful way? And so, going back to kind of the philosophical thread in this conversation, which I really enjoyed, I think this is a real moment of like reckoning in some ways of reckoning with, what do we stand for? What's
Yeah.
important to us?
what is
And
what is business for? Like,
yeah,
why are we doing this at all? Right? Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I actually really love the reframe on the bullshit jobs
Hmm.
piece, because I mean I wholeheartedly agree. I think a lot of us are just paper pushers at the end of the day, and I
Yeah.
kind of hate that.
Hmm.
And there's so much joy people also find in moving things around, creating, connecting with their colleagues, and all of
Yeah.
that. And in an ideal world, to me, it's like let's create more space for us to like push paper that we're really proud of and happy about
Yeah.
around, create more things that we're excited about.
I mean, I've been a trainer and a workshop leader for a long time. I've
Mm,
led them in all sorts of different contexts and different business environments and things. And one thing I've noticed consistently is that often it's not so much what the topic is. People, maybe they come to learn, they do, or maybe they come for the credential. Often that's a big, because people want to advance their career. But also humans, we're highly social primates. We like to
Yeah.
be together. And
Yeah.
often the workshop is just the excuse to be together. And sometimes I think maybe that's what business is for a lot of us too, is like
Totally.
it's an excuse to be together. It'd be nice if it allowed us to to feed us. Our colleague, Joe O'Connor, who's working on whose book I highly recommend. I'm in the middle of it right now. It's wait, what is it? Do More in Four. So he's a big advocate for the 4-day work week. And actually reading that book, I'm like, oh yeah, like we should like I do want to do business, but I don't want to do it all the time, right? I
Yeah.
have other things that I
Yeah.
want to do. And I also
Yeah.
I love, I'm just not the kind to retire because I love to do things in my spare time, go to shows or
Yeah.
go for walks or go to the gym or what, I do a lot of, go traveling. I do a lot of different things, but like, I don't want to do that all the time either. I want to feel
Yeah.
like I'm valuable to somebody, feel like I'm doing something for them. So,
Yeah.
and I just think, I do think AI, I'm not trying to, and maybe this is where we can wrap, but like, I'm not trying to oversell it, but I do think it's this opportunity for us to fundamentally rethink some of the fundamentals about why we do what we do, and then to do
Yeah.
them in very new ways. And I think it's going to be very, very disruptive to the way things get done over the course of the next 5 to 10 years.
I love that. I think there's sort of like a practical for the leader, I think, version of that, which is like really think through like, what are you trying to create with your business and
Yeah.
and your team and what have you, and what this means and how it might help and support. And then there's also like for the human in
Yeah.
all of us of like, what do we stand for?
Yeah.
Let's get really clear
Yeah.
in this moment. Bob, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for chatting.
Yeah. Thank you. This has been lovely.